Assalamualaikum teman-teman, jumpa lagi sama saya Hasnul Insani Johar. Kali ini kita akan melanjutkan discussion kita tentang novel yang ditulis oleh Shaila Abdullah, Saffron Dreams. Kalau kemarin kita udah ngasih introduction, siapa sih Shaila Abdullah, dan tentang some intrinsic element dari si novel Saffron Dreams itu, kali ini kita akan membahas sedikit beberapa teoris atau previous studies yang bisa teman-teman pakai untuk memahami literary text yang ditulis oleh Shaila Abdullah Saffron Dream ini. Kita lihat siapa aja sih yang akan kita bahas teori-teori di novel ini. Nah, so Muslim Diaspora in Shaila Abdullah Saffron Dream, ini dia Shaila Abdullah dan Saffron Dream yang udah kita bahas dalam episode 1. Episode yang kedua ini kita akan lebih fokus ke beberapa teoris yang bisa kita pakai untuk memahami literary text Shaila Abdullah Saffron Dream ini. Nah, yang pertama, siapa aja sih bisa dipakai atau nanti dalam discussion saya bahas ada Edward Said, seperti biasa, Orientalism, published 1978, terus Evelyn Asultani, ada Peter Murray, ada Amina Yakins, terus dalam preview studies misalnya saya bahas juga ada yang beberapa scholar yang telah investigate Shaila Abdullah Saffron Dream ini, misalnya Deborah Hall, terus Sabina Sorgun, ada lagi nanti juga Nel Lazarus, After Brah, terus Muslim Diaspora tentu relate juga dengan yang biasa ya, Islamofobia. Jadi kita perlu juga baca tentang Islamofobia, studies misalnya Islamofobia yang salah satu buku yang saya pakai adalah John Esposito dan Ibrahim Khalil yang membahas tentang Islamofobia in Muslim diaspora juga. Nah, untuk lebih pahamnya kita lihat kembali saya tuh ingin membahas apa sih misalnya. Jadi ya teman-teman, ceritanya paper saya ini examines how the Muslim diaspora is explored in Shaila Abdullah Saffron Dreams, published 2009, and in the novel Abdullah depicts her characters as victims of 9/11 attacks to challenge US dominance in 9/11 narratives, which tend to show how the US tends to become the victim instead of the perpetrator of the US invasion of Iraq. By engaging with postcolonialism with the frameworks of racial studies and non-event studies, so my paper questions U.S. anti-Muslim racism, which tends to associate Muslims with terrorism to exclude Muslims from U.S. belonging. Nah, so my presentation aims to investigate how the Muslim diaspora is depicted in the novel and to examine how this novel challenge U.S. anti-Muslim racism in Abdullah Saffron Dream. So my paper found that Abdullah Saffron Dream depicts Pakistani American struggling to seek social justice and U.S. belonging. So in doing so, this novel challenged anti-Muslim racism by depicting its protagonists as struggling to negotiate their U.S. Muslim identity, which amalgamates both their Islamic tradition and American culture. So in short, this novel reveals how the U.S. Muslim diaspora lives in the U.S. in the era of transnational neoliberalism and capitalism, which can be linked to the era of how we see that Muslims face double struggle, not only to negotiate their identities, but also to claim their rights as U.S. citizens. Now, by exploring U.S. Muslim diasporic stories, this novel suggests how Muslim diaspora not only struggle to live in U.S. after U.S. invasion of Iraq, but also is tend to be excluded from American belonging because of this relate with anti-Muslim racism, which has remained established since the beginning of U.S. emerged in 1776 until the era of global neoliberalism and capitalism. So there are some theories, misalnya Edward Said ya. So we can say that we can argue that Muslims have often emerged as a difficult existence both in Orientalist debates and U.S. media as it as it excludes from the idea of freedom and modernity. So this is why, although Edward Said's seminal work Orientalism, published in 1978, is seemingly old, it is still relevant to challenge the misrepresentation of Islam and Muslims in the Western world, especially in US and UK. So indeed, no discussion of contemporary scholarship treating the representation of Muslim is complete without the mention of Said Orientalism. You can remember that Edward Said argued that, quote, as much as the West itself, the Orient is an idea that has a history and a tradition of thought, imagery, and vocabulary that has given it reality and present in for the West. The two geographical entities thus support and to extent reflect out each other, unquote. So this question raised by Said were ones he returned to as late as 1981 in Covering Islam, where he argued that, quote, knowledge of Islam and Islamic peoples has generally proceeded not only from dominance and confrontation, but also from cultural antipathy, unquote. The importance of an engagement with Said work is evident in Evelyn As-Sultani, Peter Murray, and Aminah Yakin, 2011. For example, As-Sultani argues that, quote, the US media has stereotyped and misrepresented Arab and Muslim for over a century, with very few exceptions that sympathetic portrayal would appear during the fraud moment, unquote. So although this sympathetic depiction work on very superficial levels, which substantially function to conceal U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, As-Sultani expands the concept Said explored in Orientalism and Covering Islam by thinking through these sympathetic portrayals. Murray and Yakin, however, explore the figure of the Muslim through the categories of the enemies within and outsider. So this figuration feature often in the media through its headlines that are anonymous in the picture, portraying Muslims as unliked outsider who may live, work in the US, but still have an allegiance to value different from those recognized in Europe and North America. So these portrayals gloss over the controversy around veiling cartoons and the Prophet Muhammad, conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Israel, Palestine, or protests about the knighthood given to Salman Rushdie. So indeed, Muslims always appear as, quote, problematic, presents troubling those values of individualism and freedom set to define Western nation. Indeed, these images are distorted abstraction, which extrapolate from the context certain controversies, as they not only frame Muslim as homogeneous, zombie-like body incapable of independent through, but also represent Muslim as whipped into a frenzy and at least disturbance to their unchanging backward worldview. So in order to challenge the reductionist views or these reductionist views of Muslim, it is important to investigate how U.S. Muslim women, including Pakistani Americans such as Shaila Abdullah, tell their own experience living as a diasporic woman in the U.S. to reveal various ways of life of Muslim diaspora to challenge limited representations of Muslim women in the Orientalist debates. Indeed, you know that in Pakistani tradition and literature have been excluded from ethnic American literature, especially in Asian American studies, although there are some Pakistani American writers such as Mohsen Hamid, Nafisa Haji, and Shaila Abdullah have published their literary works since 2003 when the US invaded in Iraq. Indeed, after the invasion of Iraq, the Islamic world, including Pakistan, has become the object of the media and literature themes. For example, a literary scholar, Muniza Shamsi, in 2011, argued that Pakistan is, quote, at the center of geopolitical conflict and has been overtaken by increasing violence and religious extremism, unquote. So indeed, Pakistan represents a development of new cultural expression in music, art, and literature. Unquote. In the literary world, Claire Chambers, you still remember Claire Chambers that we discussed in Islamic literary criticism? So Claire Chambers published a book in 2008, 2011, argued that, quote, the recent flowering of Pakistani fiction in English has received much news media coverage and great critical attention when compared to the same material on the subject before the 1990s, unquote. So indeed, British Pakistani writers such as Nadim Aslam and Muhammad Hanif published many Pakistani diasporic writing, as Chambers said, quote, these undeniable excellent Pakistani writers could give the mistaken impression that Pakistani writing is dominated by male writers, unquote. Moreover, there are some creative Muslim Pakistani women's writers such as Kamila Shamsi, Laila Abdullah, Tahmima Anam. However, many of them are British Muslim women writers instead of Pakistani American background, as my presentation seeks to address. So additionally, when discussing Muslim women and literature, many of them are depicted as politically and religiously struggling to live in both homeland and hostland. As Asma Mansur published to 2014,